3 Chinese military ships travelling further south.
Air defence systems would only be able to protect the city for no more than 12 hours.
Australia has never faced so many different threats.
They'll be able to fend for themselves.
We've got 10 surface combatants right now. The Navy is as ready as it ever has been.
Ready as it ever has been.
To split Japan's head wide open and cover it with blood. What kind of country acts and talks like that?
China, 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 China.
China.
The Pine Gap Facility, often described as Australia's Area 51.
You do not need to invade Australia to defeat Australia. Let's get into it, guys. Now, we all know that Australia is an island, like, obviously, but for a long time, back in history, we've seen this to be quite an advantage, quite a safe advantage, because we're not a European country, we're not Germany and Poland being quite literally next to each other. You can't just cross the border and have a good old fight. We're not like that. We're distant. However, this ain't the early 1900s anymore, and that one advantage that we had is now gone, and the threat of grey zone tactics could absolutely destroy Australia. Like Mark Hammond said at the start of this video, you do not need to invade Australia to defeat Australia. Now let's get straight into it, guys. We've got a lot to go over in this video, and we're starting with our geographics. Alright guys, so in our north, China's Navy is building towards blue water capability specifically to neutralise Australia as a US staging base. Australia's 2024 National Defence Strategy called this, and I'm quoting here directly, the most complex strategic environment since World War II. In the east, we have to remember what happened last February and what was the government's response to it. Remember when China basically sails a Navy task group down through international waters near Australia? That was ridiculous. Now, there's nothing illegal about that, but that ain't the point. They get picked up over the Tasman Sea, a Virgin Australia passenger jet flight is flying along normally, and suddenly the cockpit radio picks up the broadcast from the Chinese Navy saying they're about to conduct live fire drills. Now, this happened to another Emirates flight, and then it began firing weapons. Supposedly target practice in international waters, roughly only 346 nautical miles off New South Wales. Now, guys, this is legal, but come on. Seriously, they were in international waters, so, that's where the legality comes along with it. But seriously, this is not normal behaviour. This is a message. It is calculated. Also, in the east again, they signed a security deal with the Solomon Islands back in 2022, which allowed policing support, international security assistance, and potentially allowing Chinese vessels to visit and resupply. Okay, notice something that keeps coming up here. We are not saying it's direct military Chinese base. However, we're not stupid. It does pose, as a possibility of a deeper security presence in the future and potentially at the current. Now, the Solomon Islands are roughly literally just 2,000 k's away from Queensland. Now, in the west, let's keep going. More than 99% of our trade by volume moves by sea. That's our iron ore going in and out, and crucially, our fuel coming in, which is really in no way surprising. However, it passes through the narrow strait of the Indonesian archipelago, such as the Sunda and Lombok Straits, into the Indian Ocean. The threat situation is that China wouldn't need to sail warships into Western Australia. They would simply just utilise a strategy called selective sea denial, and using advanced naval deployments like submarines and land-based, and ship-launched missiles near international trade points, they'll just block it, which is exactly what we're seeing with the Strait of Hormuz right now. The problem isn't that the strait is physically closed off. The problem is that there are bombs, unmanned systems, and sea mines effectively bobbing in the shipping lanes. This is the exact same attack. However, some would argue for Australia, the impact would be a much larger scale, as those ships routes are basically our lifeline of exports and imports. Keep on moving on, we're going to the south, so it's largely undefended. And in the words of Australia's own analysis, neglected. Okay, let's just recap this. The north is contested, the east is breached, the west is compromised, the south is ignored. But guys, we also got to remember that this isn't World War II, and any modern conflict would not be fought as so. So the reality is that for the first time in history, our geography is no longer a natural moat. We are facing a multi-front theatre of grey zone pressure, and our strategic depth has shrunk to zero. But let's go back to that one stat that we said before. Australia moves around 99% of its trade by sea. So, like, just thinking about it, we're that reliant on sea movement, okay, on the ocean for literally everything coming in and out. We're a friggin' island, you know, you would assume that that system is heavily protected. No, it's not. Australia has roughly 9 Australian flagships to its name. 9. And in a single year, around 6,170 foreign vessels come through Australian ports. So already you got a system where almost everything we're relying on is coming in on ships that we actually don't control. Now here's the part when I was researching all of this that literally made my blood boil. Because how can a country be honestly just so stupid when it comes to their protection? Under international maritime law, the flag state of a vessel can recall or redirect its ships in a national emergency. So if a country like China or any major flag state told those ships to stop servicing Australian ports, they legally just would. So the ships stop coming, supply chain stalls, and shelves start emptying within days. Then you get to the fuel, which is what we'll cover more in depth in later episodes as well. But going back, we have 9 ships to our name, with a reliance on 99% of our trade. You'd think that the government would be saying, let's go guys, let's go build some more ships, let's go buy some more ships, whatever the hell, let's just get this moving. Well, they actually did. Bit of a win. In 2022, the government said that they'll build 12 Australian flag strategic vessels. We are now 4 years later. We're in 2026, and we've got 1 ship secured. 1. You'll probably think that this can't be. Like, come on. Australia cannot be this pathetic, cannot be this useless when it comes to our trade protection. And I thought the same. You know, where's our deals with our allies? Well, Australia can't build ships fast enough domestically, okay, so it's going abroad, which is reasonable, right? You know, that's what allies are for. But the problem is where that abroad is. The Japan deal. Australia recently signed a $6.5 billion contract with Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries for 11 Mogami-class frigates. I think that's how you pronounce it. But anyway, they're good ships. They're fast to deliver. It's a pretty smart partnership. But the problem is that every major Japanese and South Korean shipyard sits inside China's missile range. And you're like, obviously it does. They're so close to each other. But the DF-17 and similar systems cover all of Japan and South Korea at ranges up to 2,000 k's. So the equation that the shipyards Australia is relying to build its future navy on are the same shipyards that could be struck in the conflict that all those ships are meant to deter. Couldn't get better. Now, the second problem, even with the new warships, Australia and the US lack the sea lift, the cargo, the ships, the tankers, the supply vessels to sustain like an operation in the Pacific. And China has already built this deliberately. The world's largest navy, largest coast guard, largest commercial fleet, and largest shipping building industry. They're all connected and all usable in conflict, which obviously they're China. So the bottom line is, new frigates matters. Nuclear submarines matter. But you cannot sustain a conflict in the Pacific if your supply chain runs through your adversary's missile range and your fuel runs out within 3 fucking weeks. So all of the admirals of the Navy and the people with the ADF, you know, saying that they're ready to defend, saying that Australia is ready for a conflict, increasing the speed of building things and all a bunch of that bullshit. The bottom line is that that's a lie. Australia cannot be in a worse position right now. And what ties everything into this is that we're relying on trade from China and the US for protection. So whilst we're close to China and have a beneficial relationship with them, they're a massive threat to us. And I doubt the US likes us being cozy with their main enemy. Now, I want to move on to the Darwin Port situation. Now, I know this has been covered a lot. However, at the time, the mainstream media spun it into, financial reasons, saying that the Northern Territory government was deeply in debt and that selling this port was a smart move because it meant 500 mil was added back into the Northern Territory. There were also publicised disputes of, Obama confronting Malcolm Turnbull, saying that the US should have been notified because Darwin holds US Marines. So it has been publicised quite a bit and it is ongoing to be publicised. However, the point that I want to get to is this. How did this deal even occur in the first place? This was 2015. It wasn't some deal from a few decades ago. This was not too long ago. So who made this deal? Who benefited from this deal? And why is it so hard to win the lawsuit from the government side right now in 2026? To start this, you need to calm down a little bit. Jesus, getting a bit heated. But let's go back to 2015. Northern Territory Chief Minister Adam Giles decided to sell a lease on the Port of Darwin, which for context, moves military equipment, it refuels ships, right now hosts thousands of rotating American Marines, which is a physical deterrent between us and the Chinese military expansion in the Indo-Pacific. But anyway, back to it. There was a 99-year lease. It was sold to a company called Lambridge Group for $506 million. Now, before we go further, I need you guys to remember these two names, because this isn't some just bad policy or, subpar movement for your state and for your nation. This puts your citizens in danger. This jeopardizes our relationship with the US. And the names that I need you guys to remember are Adam Giles, who was the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory at the time, and Andrew Robb, who was a Federal Trade Minister. And we will get into Andrew Robb more in depth in a second, but remember those two names. Now, according to Giles, the port had been operating for roughly 17 years and had never turned over a profit. Okay, so why would a company want to purchase that in the first place? Like, come on. And also, the amount paid by Lambridge Group was $506 million, which was roughly 25 times Port's earning at the time. Alternative bids from Australian and European companies were reportedly valued at lower, close to $300 million. So, just to go over it, this port is a military asset, which would cause you grief later down the track. It isn't returning a profit and was bought above the asking price by a Chinese company. Now, that seems a bit sus to me. Seems a bit sus to you. Like, it seems a bit sus. So I do not care how much money it meant to the Northern Territory. I do not care how much tax relief that you provided the citizens. I do not care. You, along with others in this deal, jeopardize national sovereignty, and this is just further evidence of the point that no one is truly Australia first. Because if they were, who in their right minds would put money above national security? Now, back to Lambridge. This company calls itself a private Chinese company. But here's the thing, China opened private markets in the late 1970s. However, the reality is that China is far beyond a simple police state. It's a communist country. The state controls absolutely everything and has influence over absolutely everybody. So no company in China is truly private, and especially this one, because while the baseline is that, no company is private in China, this Lambridge Group was also founded by a man called Yang Qing, who is a member of the Chinese People's Republic Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, and Xi Jinping himself has publicly directed the CPPCC members to uphold, and I'm quoting here, uphold the CPC leadership without wavering. Yang Xing's own company has a CCP branch. God, there's too many acronyms, guys. I've had it with these acronyms. Just one side thing. I can't remember all these acronyms. It's ridiculous. But back to the point. They had a CCP structure, which was a branch, embedded into its corporate structure. And in 2014, 1 year before the Darwin deal, Lambridge set up a People's Armed Militia unit inside the company with direct support from the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, another acronym, let's just put it on the pile, but that was inside the company. Now, that controls the port, and Yang Qing didn't hide what he was doing. He said it himself. The Port of Darwin deal was, in his own words, our involvement in One Belt, One Road, which is Beijing's global infrastructure strategy that Western intelligence agencies have consistently addressed as a geopolitical leverage tool. So he literally told us what he was doing. Now, guys, do not turn this episode off yet, because when I was researching this, I literally found out the information and fact-checked it at least 10 times, because I was going, like, this, I cannot believe this is true, but it is. It's quite scary. Let's bring it back to the logic. Our military asset, Darwin Port, is owned basically by the Chinese Communist Party, who has a global domination plan. Brilliant. So let's go back to our main point. How did a deal like this get waved through? The Northern Territory government approved it, the federal government, under Abbott, and then Turnbull didn't block it, and the defense, they had no concerns. But that name I wanted you guys to remember, Andrew Robb, the Federal Trade Minister, the architect of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, one of the most powerful trade figures in the country at the time, he was photographed in Darwin in 2015, standing right next to Ying Ching, standing next to Josh Frydenberg, who was then the treasurer. And now, what happened next? This is literally like, you can't make this shit up. Andrew Robb leaves Parliament, and the day before the 2016 federal election, literally the day before, he starts a new job. Where does he start? Consultant to Lambridge Group for $880,000 a year. The Trade Minister, who presided over this deal, walked directly out of Parliament and got onto the payroll of a company that got the port. For nearly $1 million a year on top of that, when Four Corners exposed it, Robb said that he acted in accordance with his responsibilities at the time. Why does every politician think that the Australian people are stupid? He then quietly resigned from the Lambridge role just weeks before the new foreign interference laws would have required him to register as a foreign agent. The timing, guys, as always, was immaculate. So what did the ASIO say during all of this? Well, Duncan Lewis, Director General at the time, said publicly, "You wake up one day and find decisions made in your own country that are not in the interest of our country." But what's happening today? That happened over 10 years ago. You would think by now, Prime Minister cycle, something would have happened. Well, it has. But it's not real positive. We're in a legal battle. As of late 2024, Lambridge was financially distressed, sued by 14 major creditors, warning publicly that an insolvency event could occur, meaning operational control of Darwin Port could end up in the hands of an unknown creditors due to a forced sale, with zero Australian government input of who it goes to next. During the 2025 federal election, both Albo and Dutton finally admitted the situation had changed. Albo said the port needed to be in Australian hands, and Dutton called the original decision a mistake. But Lambridge still runs port today, and Ying Ching is still fighting to keep it. He's lodged international legal action through the World Bank, arguing a forced sale is discriminatory and citing the Australia-China, free trade agreement. The very agreement Andrew Robb built. The Chinese ambassador personally toured the port and publicly backed Lambridge. Everyone knows each other. They always know each other. Now, let's just sum this up with a little nice bow. Okay, get the full picture yet again. We've got a lot of information coming through. Let's just get the full picture. Ying Ching, a CCP advisory board member with a company that has an embedded PLA militia unit, who publicly blessed the port as a part of Beijing's global strategy, holds a 99-year lease on Australia's most critical northern military port. Hey, Andrew Robb, the Trade Minister who presided over the deal, left Parliament and was on Lambridge payroll within 24 hours for $880,000 a year. He left that role just before foreign influence laws would have flagged him. Both major parties called it fine, then they called it a mistake, and they still haven't fixed it. And people then say to us, why do Australians specifically have such a prejudice against politicians? This is why. They commit acts that completely undermine national sovereignty and don't even try to cover their tracks while doing it. They don't even have the decency to do it behind the curtain. This is why Australians do not like politicians. And this is just so evident that no one actually cares about Australia. But out of all of this, it's all about money. It's all about who you know. It's all about how can we get this deal that seems like it's for Australia and actually designed to benefit us. It's actually quite sad going through this. These people are supposed to be the brave ones in society. The ones putting up their hands saying, yep, I'm standing for my state, I'm standing for the Australian people, I believe this country should be run like this. That's what they're supposed to do. But they don't. They literally throw us under the bus. Okay guys, let's talk about Pine Gap, because whilst everyone has been up in arms for decades about its operations, about what actually goes on inside the facility, Pine Gap provides targeted data using extrajudicial or disproportionate strikes, making Australia complicit in war crimes, which was under, international humanitarian law. Pine Gap is actually a massive threat to us right now. So let's get into it, guys. The facility is located about 18 km southwest of Alice Springs, right in the middle of Australia. The government calls it a joint facility between Australia and the United States, a 50-50, agreement. Now, I don't know about you guys, but it doesn't sound very joint when, despite being on Australian soil, the facility has always been run by an American, like always. The chief of Pine Gap is an American, and the deputy is always an Australian. Now, what Pine Gap actually does is supposedly intelligence, so, counterterrorism and early warning of missile launches, things like that. But going back to that employer hierarchy, it sounds like it's an American base in Australia that Australians are allowed to work at. And before anyone says it's some crazy conspiracy theory, that's not even my argument. Declassified documents have described Pine Gap as an American facility that Australia is granted access to. The United States built it, the United States maintains it, the United States funds the core infrastructure. Now, the part that nobody likes talking about, for years, there were reports that intelligence coming out of Pine Gap was being used in drone strikes. Then the Shodan leaks happened. They confirmed that Pine Gap intelligence was being used to help identify and locate targets. Drone strikes have happened in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, countries Australia never has formally declared war on. Yet Australian personnel may have been involved in providing intelligence that helped those strikes be possible. And here's the really interesting part. The United States never signed the Rome Statute, but Australia did, meaning Australians potentially face legal questions that Americans just simply don't. Has any Prime Minister ever sat down and answered things directly about, questions? Not really. But back to 1975, before that signing, let's talk about something that sounds completely insane until you start reading the documents yourself. Go Whitlam started asking questions, serious questions, who was running Pine Gap? What exactly was happening there? Why were intelligence agencies operating the way that they did in that zone? Quite simple questions when you really think about it. They're not hard questions, they're quite simple. However, according to multiple accounts, Whitlam was preparing to publicly expose a CIA operative named Richard Stallings. He was talking about reviewing Pine Gap, potentially cancelling the lease, demanding answers. Then November 11th, 1975 happened, the day Whitlam was removed from office, the exact same day. Now, to be crystal clear, there was no, declassified document that conclusively proves that the CIA orchestrated Whitlam's dismissal. That would be, irresponsible claim. But here's what we do know. Whitlam was asking questions. Whitlam was challenging intelligence agencies. Whitlam was threatening Pine Gap. A CIA operative was active in Australia, and before Whitlam could publicly say what he intended to say, he was gone. And at the very least, that's one hell of a coincidence. And here's my question. If there was nothing to hide, why has there never been a full investigation? Why are people arrested when they go to Pine Gap? Why hasn't the relevant archives been opened? Why are Australians expected not to ask questions? In which it should be our right to ask questions about basically a foreign base in our country. Now you might be thinking, well, Australia, the US, they have a close relationship. The US, it's a permanent blind spot over the Eastern Hemisphere, not being able to see, critical regions like mainland Asia and the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. So why not have a base in Australia that would secure geographic analysis of the southern and eastern hemisphere? And in some instances, yes, this was a simple deal. However, this facility is arguably more important today than it has ever been. Under AUKUS, Australia is becoming increasingly interrogated into American military planning. US B-52 bombers are operating out of northern Australia. US submarines will use HMAS Sterling. Billions of dollars are being spent on infrastructure to support American military operations in this country. Now, guys, let's just back it up for a second and let's still in the hypotheticals. If the United States and the Iran conflict escalates into a full-scale war, which in my opinion, it's extremely likely to, and we'll get into that in a later episode of this series. But back to the point, Pine Gap becomes a key strategic asset. Now the issue is that Pine Gap is a United States military intelligence facility, which automatically makes it a high value target. China has already presence throughout Australia, and they also have missile capabilities that can reach us. So at the baseline, Australia is hosting a US intelligence base that provides intelligence reports of Middle Eastern missile strikes. So in a major conflict scenario, that becomes a pretty high priority target Not because Australia is directly in the war, but because the base is feeding intelligence across to the US. Now, the bigger point here is that Australia doesn't even need to be officially involved in a conflict. Just by hosting these kinds of US military assets, we are already sitting inside the risk envelope of a wider war. So let's just line this all up. Okay, Pine Gap. It sits in the middle of Australia. It is one of the most important intelligence facilities in the world. It's always ran by an American. It provides intelligence used in military operations. Australians have very little visibility into what actually happens there, and every time somebody starts asking difficult questions, the answers get very vague very quickly. Now, I'm not telling you guys what to think about the US alliance. That's a completely separate conversation. What I'm saying is this. A sovereign country should know what happens inside its own borders. A sovereign country should be able to ask questions. And a sovereign country should be able to have a public debate about facilities that could make us a target in future conflicts. Because if we can't do that, are we a sovereign nation or are we just a client state with a flag? Now, guys, we talk about, war, global emissions, and trade, but there's one thing that I always love to bring up. Australia and America are still democracies, obviously. That means red tape, bureaucracy, public opinion, elections, and politicians worrying about getting voted out in a few years. China doesn't have that problem. China and places like North Korea are communist dictatorships run by totalitarian regimes. They don't just shut down successful industries to chase, net zero targets. They care about power, wealth, and strategic dominance. So when Xi Jinping says, "Build me that refinery," it gets built. When he says, "Open that mine," it gets open and it gets done very fast, as you can imagine. The results speak for themselves. By the early 2020s, China controlled roughly 70% of global rare earth mining and more than 90% of the processing and finished metal production. While in the West, we buried ourselves in regulations, environmental restrictions, and rising costs. But China was willing to wear that environmental damage because it understood the strategic advantage. Meanwhile, Australia, despite being one of the top suppliers of critical minerals on the planet, well, we have chosen to tie ourselves up in regulations. And what makes no sense is because we all live on the same planet. Obviously. So if we're serious about protecting the environment, then everyone's got to do it. There's no point Australia being this net zero country when China's just pumping the refineries and pumping all the gas emissions out into the earth. It's not going to work. So, we also got to have a look into Labour. They wanted to shut down and continue to want to shut down traditional industries in the name of this net zero bullshit. We dig up the minerals, ship them to China, China processes them, and then we buy them back at premium. It's ridiculous. And Australia is potentially one of the wealthiest countries on earth, based on what purely is sitting beneath our feet. The minerals needed for batteries, semiconductors, defense systems, advanced technology, and our future energy production. We have them. Yet almost all of it leaves this country as raw dirt. China processes it, China refines it, China profits from it, and China controls the supply chain. And if you want an example of why that is a huge problem, just go back to 2020. Australia asked for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. That is it. We asked a question. Within weeks, China started slapping tariffs and restrictions on Australian exports. Beef, barley, cotton, a range of other industries got hit hard. But notice what they didn't touch. Iron ore. Why? Because they still needed it. They targeted the industries that they could afford to lose while protecting the imports they depended on. And basically just starved us. The message from China was pretty simple. You step out of line politically and we'll make you pay economically. So China doesn't just pose a defense risk, they are embedded throughout Australia. Our trade, our economy, our supply chain, our land ownership, everywhere you look, there is exposure. So it's pretty clear. China has a chokehold. And the question is, why are we continuing to make ourselves more dependent? Here's something else, guys, because I feel like a lot of people, maybe think that World War III will be fought like World War II. Nah, it's a completely different playing field now. Mike Burgess, the Director General right now of the ASIO, he said this: imagine the implications if a nation state took down all the networks or turned off all the power during a heat wave. I assure you, these are not hypotheticals. Foreign governments have cracked cyber teams investigating these possibilities right now. So he said that foreign governments have teams right now investigating how to turn off our power grid. And then he went back into his office, the journalists wrote their articles, the politicians gave their statements, and everybody moved on because we do not take this seriously enough in this country. And I'm going to show you exactly what is the most dangerous thing out of all of this. So, the ASIO's 2025 threat assessment. Australia's critical infrastructure is routinely under attack from state cyber threats. The threat of high impact sabotage is likely to worsen over the next 5 years. So, routinely under attack. Right now, the Australian Signals Directorate found that 1 in 10 of all reports of cybersecurity incidents in 2024 targeted critical infrastructure. November 2023, the AUKUS network went down. This wasn't an attack. This was a routing error, a mistake. In one day, over 10 million Australians and 400,000 businesses lost service, hospitals disrupted, banks offline, train systems affected, and ASIO said that services that people take for granted proved uncomfortably fragile. Here's what they didn't say out loud, but what every intelligence analyst in the room understood. The AUKUS outage was an accidental demonstration to every adversary watching of exactly how vulnerable Australia is. Not a probe, not an attack, a mistake. And it brought a modern nation to its knees for a single day. ASIO confirmed that one nation state is conducting, and I'm quoting directly here, multiple attempts to scan critical infrastructure in Australia and other countries targeting water, transport, and energy networks, using highly sophisticated tradecraft to map networks, test vulnerabilities, knock on digital doors, and check the digital locks. They didn't name the one nation state publicly, but Australia's own cyber threat report confirmed that the People's Republic of China affiliated actors targeted major global telecommunications providers in a broad and significant cyber espionage campaign. Now guys, we've got to talk about Medibank 2022. Hackers publicly attributed to Russian cyber criminal with state links broke into Medibank Private. I'm sure you guys remember this. They extracted the private health records of 9.7 million Australians. And this isn't just names and email addresses, this is medical records. So diagnoses, mental health histories, pregnancy terminations, drug and alcohol treatments. They published it on the dark web when Medibank refused to pay 9.7 million Australians. Their most intimate personal information was exposed. And what happens? Well, Australia issued its first ever cyber sanction, a travel ban and an asset freeze, against the individual responsible in January 2024, 14 months later. And that was against a Russian-based cyber criminal who has never come into Australia anyway. That was my opinion there. And going back on this, come on, a travel ban, really, that's it. The message sent to every adversary watching yet again was this: attack Australian civilians, steal their most sensitive personal data, post it publicly, and 14 months later, you'll get a travel ban that really means nothing to you. Guys, is it seriously any wonder why these attacks keep on coming? Now guys, to wrap all of this up, here's my honest take. I think Australia stopped being a fully sovereign nation a long time ago. I think both major parties, Liberal and Labor, it doesn't matter which rosette they wear, they have been complicit in it. Not through some drastic single act of betrayal, through 50 years of incremental surrender, decision by decision, deal by deal, lease by lease. We handed a CCP-linked billionaire a 99-year lease on our most strategic port and called the people who raised concerns alarmist. We let a federal trade minister approve that deal, walk out of parliament, and go straight into the same company's payroll for $880 grand a year. And nobody went to jail. Nobody was charged. Nobody was seriously investigated. We built a base in the middle of our own country, put an American in charge of it, and used it to help locate people for strikes in countries we never voted to go to war with. And we don't even get to see the paperwork. We are now parking nuclear-capable bombers on our soil, building submarine bases for another nation's fleet, and spending $368 billion of taxpayer money on a defense system that cannot operate independently. The political class calls this a partnership. I call it dependency. I call it the comfortable surrender of a nation that got so addicted to the security blanket of a powerful ally and forgot how to stand up straight on its own. Now, I'm not saying ditch America. In a world that contains the Chinese Communist Party, I know which side I'd rather be on. That is not the question. The question is whether we're a sovereign nation, or like we said before, are we a client state with a flag? And I'm not going to let what our families built and fought and laid down their lives to go to waste. That thought absolutely disgusts me. So guys, I'm not done asking questions. I'll see you in the next episode of this investigative series. Thanks, guys.